Hello, my friends. Today I'm going to talk about how the free market has affected the U.S. military. This is a subject that is just so impossible to really talk about because there are so many angles to it, but it can be really condensed down to a very simple statement. The U.S. military is far too big, and this isn't just about protection or defense anymore, and many people know that. In fact, most folks are pretty well aware that the U.S. military has more power than the next 10 countries combined, which is changing quickly with China, whose military is definitely getting up there. The point of this really isn't to bash on war or, say we need to totally get rid of our military. What it is to kind of shed a little bit of light onto something that I'm always surprised more people aren't aware of, and that is our garrison around the world. We have turned the entire world into a military base for the United States. And I know most folks know that we have bases overseas, but it turns out a lot of people don't realize to what extent we really have these bases. Now, a couple of years back, there was an incident in Niger where some soldiers were killed at a base. And a lot of Americans were surprised by that because they didn't realize, well, we have bases in Africa? And as it turns out, we have, I believe, 46, last time I checked, bases in Africa in various areas. Sometimes they even conflict with China, who wanted to build one in one of the African countries there. I don't remember which country it was, but there was a conflict because the U.S. military is worried now because we're pretty much the only military who has bases around the world. And if I were to ask how many do you think that we have, how many military bases on other continents would you think that we have, and in other countries? And it turns out to be about 800 from what I've checked last time. And from other sources, including smaller bases or outposts, there could be 1,000 military bases from the United States around the world. That is a lot of money, a lot of resources, and a lot of soldiers' lives on the line for perhaps uses we don't even understand. Why do we have 46 military bases in Africa? We talk about keeping terrorism down, but let's just break this down for a minute. What is the most important role that a military plays for a country? Border defense and protection of its people. And in the modern era, with long-distance warfare, we take the fight to them. And the idea, at least we were told after 9/11, and we went into Iraq for some strange reason, even though all of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, we continue to funnel tons of weapons into Saudi Arabia, and we used it as an excuse to go into Iraq. And they have a huge oil deposit. And to this day, there's still people who really think, actually still believe, that we went in there because of weapons or to free the people. We watched this whole thing unfold. First it was to get Osama, and then it was this Operation Iraqi Freedom. Oh, that was after we, couldn't find any weapons of mass destruction. Meanwhile, there are plenty of other countries that are working on weapons like that. They just don't have the same resources. And if you don't think it's about resources, think again. It's always about resources. We go to war in places where we can benefit or where we think that we can nip some kind of issue in the bud. But usually terrorism is not on the top of our list. And if you really look at how much America has actually been affected by terrorism or anything of the sort, we've had it pretty damn easy. So what is the excuse for having so many bases and so many soldiers around? It's frustrating to me. Now, as I mentioned before, my father was in Vietnam. His father was in World War II. My other grandfather was in World War II. That's why I decide every time I talk about war, I wear my dad's dog tags and my other grandfather's rings. And Vietnam basically killed my dad. When he came back, of course I only heard stories from my mom because I was young. He died when I was 14, 15, but I didn't know him as well as I'd like to as an adult, right? And I have his poetry that he wrote, and he was psychologically heavily damaged by that experience, as one would expect going into war in a country where we don't belong, where there's no need for us to be there, where we're fighting a guerrilla. This is one of the first real guerrilla warfare experiences our country had had, and it changed the paradigm of war. And today, this has become even more complicated. It's one thing when we were fighting on the battlefield, in red or blue. It's ridiculous to think that anybody's going to stand for that kind of warfare if you're invading their country. In other words, if it's not a war that you're fighting on equal agreement, which it rarely is, what's happened is after Vietnam, guerrilla warfare got even worse. And the reason why terrorism and warfare is so, even though we have more technology now, the reason why it's become so difficult is because in the past, the people wanted to protect their country. They wanted to defend their country. And if you were a citizen and you stood behind what your country and you believed in your people, then you would avoid conflict if possible, because they could bomb the hell out of you, and you knew that. Well, today there's many of these terrorist groups. They have no actual home. They have no state, and therefore, what do they have to lose? In other words, if you put yourself in someone else's shoes, and if you'd spent the years raising your children constantly in fear of bombs dropping, and then one day some coalition forces dropped a bomb that killed your family, and you were left alone, you would be pissed, and you would do everything you could to seek revenge against those who unnecessarily took innocent lives. And civilian casualties have been a cornerstone of military processes. Just think about the World War II. I mean, that's a very complicated issue, but dropping a nuke is a decision that has to be weighed, and it was a poor decision. But at the same time, a lot of people would have said, "Oh well, it kept wars from getting worse over the years." Whatever. There's no justification for it at this point to kill civilians. Yet we continue to do it with drone strikes, even with our precision-guided weapons. And as soon as you start talking about these things, there are folks out there who would, you've got to support the troops. Don't be un-American, support your military. And no, I don't agree. You do not have to support the actions your military takes. You do not have to say, well, it's us against them. That type of mentality is a choice to make. And if you believe the authority of what your leaders are telling you, I mean, at one time, our best interests may have, been for our country. Today, we have thousands of contractors throughout all of these countries and bases. This is a money-making venture. These contractors move in, they take over resources. We've basically privatized our military in the same way that the drug wars we've created within our own country has allowed us to make money by privatizing the prisons. It's really no different. And all of your tax dollars are going to that. They're going to fund these military bases, which what I read is the value of just the bases themselves that we have in other countries are worth $750 billion. We're $750 billion. And that's probably guessing low. And that doesn't include land and it's pretty intense when you think about the benefits we could do for our country with those kind of resources. Using metals and materials over there instead of here at home. When we've got our infrastructure crumbling, things are falling apart. It's just this appeal to authority. It really is. And this idea that we really live in a free country and it's a democracy, but these choices are made for us by lobbyists, pharmaceutical industries, and here comes the street sweeper. It would only be that the noisiest possible truck would drive by while making a video, but that's okay. I'm glad he's cleaning the street. He's got some leaves out there. So anyhow, back on track here. This isn't intended to be a depressing video. It's intended to be informative. I want Americans that don't know these things to realize just how large our presence is elsewhere and what kind of damage that does, not just for the lack of resources that we could use in our own country, but for the destruction to other people's land, stripping of their resources, and the most important and crucial aspect is the building of resentment against our country. If we want to be loved as a country because of our freedoms, that illusion is over. The idea that our own government spies on us, that pretty much if you want to speak up against anybody who has power, you're just going to be shut down through frivolous lawsuits or lobbying efforts to shut down raw milk producers because they're a huge danger to the environment and the people's health. Or the idea that we're going to fight against this horrible drug, marijuana, that's worse than heroin, and now these old PSA campaigns like Reefer Madness have become jokes in our country, but it's serious business because people actually put out this propaganda as if it was real. And I compare the drug war to our other wars because it's being fought on our own people in our own country, and in the end nobody benefits except for the legal drug manufacturers, alcohol companies, pharmaceutical companies. In fact, the Drug-Free America movement was sponsored in part by alcohol companies and also funded by pharmaceutical industry. As long as you're taking the drugs they want you to take, right? And it's really that bad. It's easy to jump from what I'm saying here into the whole conspiracy realm of it's all about mind control and the people are being fooled through behavior control, behavior modification. It's all true. It's just that we are doing it willingly. It's not through these beams or HARP that's shooting these rays through the atmosphere that are causing us to be lazy. It's not the fluoride in our drinking water that's making us stupid. It's us choosing laziness and choosing not to study and research and understand these things and then speak out against them with an educated mind. I can't do much more about the military than sit here and discuss it and tell you about it. Most of you probably are already aware. But living in an empire, being aware of that, people have become aware, and this is why the military has had harder and harder time finding more and more troops to fill more and more bases. And this is why they started giving out college educations way back, and this is why they have to go out in front of high schools and try to recruit people out of their desperate times when they're young and dumb and don't know better. And I'm not saying that nobody should ever join the military, because that would be foolish. I know that at this point in history, we do need a standing military, at least to protect our own borders. But let me just tell you this. The one difference about America, the one thing that whether you love it or hate it, is there's a firearm for every individual here. And if anybody invaded these borders and tried to manually, house to house, take over this country, it would be hell to pay for them. And on top of that, if our own government or our own country decided it was going to, take over or dominate, just remember there's always a way to fight back. Americans are creative, but it seems like we're losing our innovative nature and just sitting and eating this processed food and watching television and mindlessly going about our days without really caring about what's going on. And I'm not saying people aren't caring at all. There's a lot of people who are pissed off out there. But that anger has turned into some really sour decisions politically and otherwise. And now we've turned against one another. Finding that common ground is getting harder. But I think we can all agree that the military could downsize a little bit and we could use some of that money for our own infrastructure to help our own people. Because, the cost of those bases could probably pay for health care for 100 million Americans. So, be well, my friends. I'll talk to you later. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think. I'm sure you will. And I'll talk to you again soon.